Detta föredrag tillhandahålls av Teofil, som är en evangelikal teologiförening som verkar för en förnyad frimodighet över Kristus och Bibeln. För mer information om oss, besök www.teofil.nu.
Okay. I think everyone has found a seat. And I should say welcome back, or welcome here for the first time again. For us who've been here since the morning, we've been listening to Professor Wright, N.T Wright, Tom Wright, talking about the resurrection. And tonight we have a panel discussion with some people. Johannes will lead the discussion and introduce each one of them and give you the rules, as it were. It won't be a proper debate, it will be a friendly dialogue about the resurrection, fruitful as such. And we have been enjoying Professor Wright's talking on the resurrection and the meaning of it. What have we lost the meaning of the resurrection? Tonight, the topic is, has the church lost the resurrection? So shifting focus a little bit, more practical, more down to earth maybe, if you so like. And we who host this conference, it's Teofil, it's Credo, Swedish Credo, it's an IPS connected movement, student organization, and Teofil is working with theology students primarily here in Lund. And annually we put on a conference, and this is, I think, it's the best one we've had so far. Don't tell the other ones. And that's not just for the statistics. We've been all been very excited and glad about having Professor Wright here to talk. So, welcome.
It is rumored in academic circles in Britain that one of the Friday entertainments among professors is to pick up a PhD thesis written by a Swede in what is supposed to be the English language, and they read aloud and laugh. So maybe we can say something. Is that correct? You want to go to one? Okay. We thought that maybe a perfect gift for Professor Wright to bring back home to Britain would be a video panel session held in Sweden. Yeah. So this is our thank you gift. Okay. The topic of this evening is, has the church forgot the resurrection? And since we planned for 1.5 hours, you might guess that the answer is not a simple no to this question. So it's all about Easter, or Pesach. God commanded the Israelites to celebrate Pesach as a memorial day every year. And God said, you should tell your son on that day, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. So the fathers told their sons to remember, and their sons in their turn told their sons to remember, and their sons told their sons. Until one day, a man celebrating this Memorial Day said to his disciples, this is my body and this is my blood. Do this in remembrance of me. And the church continued to celebrate Eucharist until today. But maybe some element got lost during the process and during the way. Maybe we today, as often did Israel, need a prophet who reminds us of the totality of Easter. Maybe we need a resurrection of what Easter is all about. So we from Teofil has invited some prophets to share with us on this topic. And first and foremost, of course, Professor and Bishop Nicholas Thomas Wright. Professor Wright is one of the leading scholars in the field of New Testament studies today. He has written extensively on Paul and the historical Jesus, both academic and popular books. His opus magnum is a series called Christian Origins and the Questions of God, and it contains 6 volumes like this, where the fourth one will be released next month. And we have Bengt Holmberg, who is Professor Emeritus at Lund University in New Testament Studies. He held that position between 2000 and 2007. He is also ordained as priest in the Swedish Church and has, during his life, taught in different countries such as Norway, Tanzania, and Jerusalem. Yes. Stefan Gustafsson is the leader of Svenska Evangeliska Alliansen. Do you have an international name? He is the director of Credoakademin, a one-year Bible school in Stockholm, focusing on apologetics. He's famous in Sweden for his book Kristen på goda grunder. And we also have Dan Sarkar, who is also priest in the Swedish church, and he serves in a local parish here close to Lund. During this evening we will listen to each one of these. We will have a short session in 7 minutes or something like that, and then we will have a further discussion. And first out is N.T Wright.
Thank you very much. I had never heard that about Swedish PhD theses, and we are not in a position to talk because you ought to see what it would be like if I tried to write a thesis in Swedish. What we more often do, instead of reading Swedish theses and laughing, is read American theses and weep. Apologies to those Americans who may be in the room. I have been asked to speak for 7 minutes, so that didn't count. That was I was fascinated by this question, has the church lost the resurrection? Because I think my answer is, in the Western church, largely yes. I've spoken a bit about this already today, but my awakening to this came one of the first times that I went to Greece and was in Athens for an Easter celebration. And I realized we don't do anything like this at home. They really do Easter well, and it's a whole community event, and it goes on, and people have different ways of celebrating, and there is a real excitement about Easter which seems to grip them. Now, the West and the East churches split off from one another 1,000 or so years ago, and in the West we developed particularly a theology of the cross, and I think the East actually needs that as well, more than they have it, but they carried on with a strong theology of resurrection and new creation, which is often very exciting when we Westerners encounter it. Instead, I find in the Western world, even when Christians are doing their best to represent a true Orthodox biblical Christian faith, the hymns, the prayers that we use in our liturgies, the way that people often preach, even on Easter itself, is much more about going to heaven than it is about resurrection and new creation. And that is, as it were, colluded with the Enlightenment vision, whereby all religion is really about private spirituality rather than about things which happen in the public world. And the point about the bodily resurrection is that however difficult it is to describe, it not only happened in the public world in some sense or other, but has implications for the public world. And we have largely, in my church at least, we have largely lost that. As I say, I think this goes back particularly to the Middle Ages. If you go to some churches in, say, Italy, and look at the paintings, the frescoes, the murals, then the ones from the early or Middle Ages sometimes have depictions of resurrection, where you have, as in Ezekiel 37, bodies coming up out of the bones coming up out of the ground and turning into bodies and so on. They're trying to talk about that. By the time you get to Michelangelo and the Sistine Chapel, there is maybe the odd hint of resurrection, but the main thing is heaven and hell. And while heaven and hell are important, resurrection is far more important as the ultimate question which is there in the New Testament. In my own country, I have no idea how this is in Sweden, in my own country, the Church of England has crept back towards various medieval Catholic practices. For instance, in relation to the celebration of All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day on November the 1st and November the 2nd. And this is quite new in my lifetime, where people have started doing All Souls' Day, praying in a rather gloomy fashion for the people we know who have recently died, as though we don't actually say that they're in purgatory, but there's a sense that they've still got a long journey to go and we're not sure exactly where they are. And All Saints' Day then turns into simply a celebration of the great famous saints of old, whereas I understood that in my own tradition All Saints' Day was supposed to be about all the Christian departed, of whatever age, stage, however well known or not known at all they were. So, and I see that particularly as a result of losing grip on resurrection and instead reinventing other ways of talking about post-mortem reality. Today, I think particularly, this shows up in how we celebrate Easter itself, or how we don't celebrate Easter itself. In my tradition, most churches in the mainstream, Anglican and Roman at least, certainly Orthodox, sometimes Methodist as well, will keep Holy Week, the week before Easter, with some reasonable solemnity, with Palm Sunday, and then maybe special events during the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday of Holy Week, and then some kind of commemoration of the institution of the Lord's Supper, the Last Supper, on the Thursday, and then of course Good Friday, and then nobody quite knows what to do on Holy Saturday, whether they're still supposed to be feeling sad about Good Friday or getting all the decorations ready for Easter Day, but anyway, then Easter lasts precisely for most people about 3 or 4 hours. You've had Holy Week for a week, you've had Lent for 40 days, and you have Easter as a big party, often early in the morning, and then people go on holiday and sort of forget about it. And the choirs who sing the music for all this, they too usually schedule their vacations to start on the afternoon of Easter Day, so that instead of having an 8-day party or a 40-day party, as I would really like, in which the church actually got out and celebrated in public. When Paul says rejoice in the Lord always, and again I say rejoice, I don't think he just means feel happy inside yourself in a rather sort of introverted way. I think in the world of ancient Greece and Rome, rejoicing was something you did on the street, and people knew you were celebrating something. I think the reason why we don't ourselves take Easter very seriously is that we don't even think about celebrating it. As a hint, and I say this in my book, Surprised by Hope, you might start by having champagne for breakfast for at least 1 week. It will surprise and perhaps delight your family. Believe me, I tried it. They were surprised. As a result of all that, our culture, in Britain at least, has so far forgotten what Easter is about and how the story works through Good Friday and Easter, that sometimes on the radio and the television, and even in the printed lists for television programs, they will refer to the Friday as Easter Friday, which just, if you understand it, shows the illogic of it. Good Friday is Good Friday, but they now think of it simply as a miscellaneous holiday which is inconvenient because you never know from one year to the next which weekend it's going to be on, and people don't know why that is. You mentioned Passover, Pesach. It is of course tied to the lunar cycle, but most people are so far removed from it they haven't a clue what that's about. That's understandable in the secular world. It's unforgivable in the Christian world. Easter is the major festival, and if we've lost it, shame on us, and the sooner we recapture it, the better. I think that was 6.5, 7 minutes.
7 sharp. Okay, next out, Stefan Gustafsson.
It's a great joy to be back in my hometown and at the university. and it's of course a great privilege to sit on this panel. It's deeply humbling, so I felt I need to stand up to compensate for my lack of authority. In the New Testament, the resurrection is always described as an act of God. Jesus did not rise by himself, or because of a very rare way nature can behave. No, if we read through the sermons in the book of Acts, for example, to look how the first generation of Christian describes it, we have a very coherent picture. They always formulated as an act of God. So on the day of Pentecost, Peter is saying, "But God raised him from the dead, freeing him from the agony of death." That's chapter 2. Chapter 3, Peter again speaking, "You killed the author of life, but God raised him from the dead." We are witnesses of this. In chapter 4, "Jesus Christ of Nazareth, whom you crucified, but whom God raised from the dead." Chapter 5, "The God of our fathers raised Jesus." And we could continue all through the book of Acts. God did something. This is exactly the point where we have our biggest problem in our culture. Since the Enlightenment, we have either doubted or denied the existence of God, or we have doubted or denied God's involvement in this world. So we have generally rejected all the miraculous things in the gospel. Jesus did not walk on water. He did not turn water into wine. He did not feed 5,000 people. This is fair enough. If we are on our own on this planet, then we are on our own. And miracles do not happen. And as a consequence, of course, we should give up, I think, the Christian faith. Because it is founded on the miracles. But a lot of people try to handle the situation in another way. They do not want to leave the Christian faith, but they do not want to challenge the assumptions of the Enlightenment. So what to do? Well, a common way is to start to construct the hierarchy of miracles without changing the assumption that miracles cannot happen. So, we hear a lot of Christian theologians and leaders saying, walking on water? No way. Virgin birth? Probably not. But they keep the door open a little bit. Resurrection? Yes, that's a non-negotiable. It cannot happen, but it is a non-negotiable. Very strange situation. How can you live with that? Well, maybe if you start to reinterpret the non-negotiable that Jesus rose or was raised from the dead. So then people try to reinterpret it. Maybe if we loosen the event from time, like the former Archbishop in Sweden, K.G. Hammar, has said that it was on the third day. Well, that is a symbol. But by lifting it out from the historic continuum, of course, we have the question, was it really an event? All event takes place at a certain moment instead of another moment. Or we try to loosen it from space. It was a non-bodily, non-physical, non-empirical event. It was, like Hans Küng has said, something happening within God's dimensions, not here. Or most commonly, we try to loosen it from being an objective event. So, instead, maybe it was a subjective event happening to the disciples. It's something about their inner subjective world. So, like Bultmann, even if the bones of Jesus is still in the grave in Jerusalem, my heart can be on fire and he can live within me. There is a very prominent example of this way of reasoning from Carl Reinhold Bråkenhielm, who is professor in Uppsala, and who is a very important figure within the Lutheran Church in Sweden. He is the chairman of the theological committee in Sweden. In this book, God and Darwin, it's a dialogue book between an atheistic biologist and Carl Reinhold Bråkenhielm. They are discussing relationship between faith and science. A lot of good stuff, basically showing there can be a coherence. But they are also coming into the question of the resurrection. Bråkenhielm, he identifies himself as a modified theist. He does not believe God is acting into his universe. He's a modified theist. God is sustaining his creation, but he's not acting into it. He is present in creation, but he's not working in any other way than through the natural process of his creation. Now, how then can we believe, if this is the true picture of God and the world, how can we believe in resurrection? Well, Bråkenhielm says the resurrection of Jesus is non-negotiable. He has done away with the other miraculous events in the Gospels, but the resurrection is non-negotiable. And I would like to give you a quote of how he then argues. Being a modified theist, saying the resurrection is non-negotiable. He starts by quoting Hans Küng on Being a Christian. This is the quote. The resurrection cannot be a historical event in the strict sense. It is not an event which can be verified by historical science with the aid of historical methods. For the raising of Jesus is not a miracle violating the laws of nature, verifiable within the present world, not the supernatural intervention which can be located and dated in space and time. There was nothing to photograph or record within the grave. Bråkenhielm affirms this quotation, and then he goes on. But can you do this in any other way than construe the underlying course of events as a divine breach of the natural law that dead people do not come to life again? And here is his answer. The answer depends on how we perceive the possibilities of faith to transform and renew. In itself, there is nothing peculiar with the idea of religious experience implying a fundamental upheaval for a particular person. But the stories about the resurrection of Jesus hint at the unique and unprecedented new creation of a human life. Maybe the idea of creative matter can offer an opening. The resurrection could be described as a distant analogy to a course of events that, in a more immediate sense, can be seen in nature and in biological evolution. The first cell arose from the primeval soup. In a similar sense, Christ rose. In reality, this is a course of event which was already apparent on the cross. Jesus faced suffering and death with a faith that recreates and transforms. Amongst his followers, his death did not create a despairing resignation, but faith. If I understand his answer right, he says, how can we believe in resurrection if we don't believe God is acting into the world? He takes 3 steps. He first says, it depends on the possibilities of faith. So he moves the whole discussion to the area of faith, not an actual event. It is about faith. It is about the transforming power of a religious experience. Secondly, he gives an analogy of how life arose in the primeval soup. So it's something that is a possibility within nature. And thirdly, he thinks that Jesus illustrates it by the faith he showed facing death. And Jesus' faith was transferred to his disciples. In my view, nothing is left here of the original message of the apostles that I started to quote in the book of Acts. He has totally done away, in a very complicated way, with the whole idea of resurrection. I have recently read a new book called Ge mig min son ditt hjärta by Eskil Frank. Eskil Frank was a few years ago a candidate of being Archbishop in Sweden. Now in this book he tells the story of how he lost his faith and how he left the priesthood. It's a moving book, it's a sad read. The reason is he could no longer believe in the resurrection. The surprise is that he's not presenting any arguments against the resurrection. The stumbling block seems to be that Jesus has not come back yet, but he's not giving any reasons for denying the first event. But I admire his honesty. He does not believe in the resurrection, therefore he leaves the faith. And in my view, that is, I have more respect for that and for trying to reinterpret the message. I began by quoting Acts. I will finish. I began by quoting Acts. I think we need to go back to the whole issue of worldviews. Is the universe an open or closed system of cause and effect? Everyone agrees that it is a system of cause and effect. No one should question the scientific understanding of nature. The question, which is not a scientific question, is the system closed for God, like it seems to be for Brokenhill, or is it an open system where God actually can act into his own creation? Thank you.
Professor Homme.
Well, I have been asked to say something, reflect about if there is a kind of climate welcome to discuss or investigate or to say anything about the resurrection of Jesus in an academic milieu, and if that has changed. And of course, such a task is a very big one. You could go on for hours and days, perhaps, so this will be a very shallow, generalizing type of reflection from me. I think you could say that the classic assumptions of academic exegetes up to recent times, or even up to now, were to a large degree decided by the rationalist philosophy of the European Enlightenment from the 18th century and onwards. And this leans more or less strongly towards a naturalistic and materialist perception of reality, in which it is not even necessary to argue for the non-existence of God. That is simply taken for granted. There is no God. No proof for God's existence can be brought forward. At least there is no God who can do anything in our world with us. And we heard some examples given by Stefan from Kung and Brokenhill. So it's still alive, that kind of opinion. That we don't need to begin to discuss such a thing. And it's usually said, which is to some degree right, of course, that you can't include any statement about divine action in historical explanation, because that is not a factor controllable by us. We are not able to prove that in this event it was working, in that event it was not. God works in mysterious ways, not discernible to us. So historical research is limited. It can only investigate our everyday, normally operating human world, and leaves everything else aside as necessarily outside what can be grasped by human knowledge. And that is why, for example, Bart Ehrman, a well-known American scholar, who started as, you could say, almost a fundamentalist evangelical, and now has lost his faith. And I just stumbled upon a discussion between him and the Christian apologist William Craig. And in that discussion he says about the resurrection that any other explanation or hypothesis on why the tomb of Jesus was empty on the third day is vastly more probable than the Christian hypothesis that God rose him up from death, or raised him up from death to everlasting life. And he proposes to a degree of about 90% a social construct. It is believed because people have sort of agreed or been persuaded to believe so. Stories are invented and told to give coherence and meaning to the bewildering flood of perceptions that surround us every day. We must try to make the world meaningful, and so we make the theories. We sort of construct the reality. This is inevitable. And common knowledge consists of interpretations and perspectives propagated in clever ways by those who are in power. So the first critical question one puts to new or old ideas brought forward is not, what is the evidence for this? That's a typical rationalist question, but rather, who says this and why? Who has interest in spreading this view of reality or the facts of a case? And that is an attitude which has a lot of roots in Marxism, but also in feminism, which are much more interested in a kind of power analysis than in epistemology. So every opinion, every truth put forward is seen as a kind of power game. You say it because you want it to be true. That is a kind of opening idea. You think this is true because you want to think it is true. But can no real truth be had? No, not very easily. So truth has been degraded to opinion, and that means that my opinion is simply my truth. It may not be your truth, but it is mine, and who can decide? One is as good as the other. I would say that this kind of attitude has made some inroads also into academia, academic theology, and but the other side is, to put it briefly, I'm being looked at, so I think I should stop now. Something about the possibility and desirability of investigating the evidence on the resurrection of Jesus. Now, exegetes are divided. Just let me mention two examples. One is John P. Meyer, a Roman Catholic American exegete, who began a large series of books about what he calls a marginal Jew, that is Jesus, in 1991. And in the first of those books, in 1991, he said that I will not discuss the resurrection of Jesus at all in all this work, because this is so much, you could say, caught up with or caused by faith that it cannot be agreed upon at all by any scholar. The Christians will do, of course, but not the other. And as we remember, God can't be included in historical explanations, so this has to be left out. Of course, you could say, and I have said it somewhere, that I think he should have treated this in the same way that he treats the miracles of Jesus. In volume 2, he devotes more than 500 pages to discussing them. Well, the question he leaves out, he says openly, it is, are these miracles? Well, that's a God question, he says. I leave that out. He only treats the question, did they happen? And a good number of them did happen, according to Meyer. Historical probability points to the fact that many of Jesus' healings actually did take place. But he can't discuss the role of God in that. And my other example would be N.T Wright, that the resurrection of Jesus can and should be investigated. It is a historical fact in the meaning that it had great consequences and repercussions in researchable history. It's the beginning of Christianity, to put it briefly, and so it should be investigated as much as we can. And you wrote a book of 800 pages about it.
Thank you. Let's have Don Sacken.
Well, since I'm a countryside parish priest, I was asked to join this panel of learned persons, and I'm very delighted to be here. Has the church lost or forgot the resurrection? The answer is no. A sacramental church can never forget the resurrection. Because when we baptize people, we can't just baptize them to the death of Christ. We cannot just kill them. They have to rise again. The baptism is both a baptism into the death of Christ and to the resurrection of Christ. And likewise, in the Eucharist prayer, we confess the death of Christ and we proclaim the resurrection of Christ until He returns. And lex orandi is lex credendi. What we pray, the words we use when we worship, that forms our beliefs. So I don't think that a sacramental church can forget the resurrection, lose the resurrection. However, I think the church has lost the story of the resurrection, of what happens after life, not after death, after life at all. Our story is not normative any longer. At funerals, it's not uncommon to meet Christians who think they're going to heaven, and non-believers who are confident in that there is no God, but He will welcome them in an eternal life. But the story of what happens after life is a non-materialistic story. It's a non-bodily story. It's a story of spirits, of ghosts, of pneuma, but it's not a story of the body and the resurrection of the body. I talked to a colleague when I was traveling here today, and we agreed that there are problems when we try to teach about this carnal resurrection, because when we do that, people start to wonder, well, these houses, this house, this building, the enormous cathedral of Lund, will it stand in the new world? Well, yes, we believe. Well then, what about these Stone Age houses? Will they be in the new world also? And the people from back then, will they? Well, what age will we have? What clothes will we wear? And are we going to play trumpets or electric guitars? The point is, this raises more questions than it raises hope. So my question to you, Professor Bishop Wright, is how should we think and teach and proclaim the hope of the resurrection of the body? Let me finish with saying that for the church, I think that people meeting the risen Christ reminds us of the resurrection, of the power of the resurrection. Let me tell you about a couple of persons from our church. Jonas was Broby's, my hometown's, worst criminal. He was a drug dealer. He tried to cheat his friends, like drug dealers used to do. They didn't like that, so they beat him so heavily that he fell into a coma. He was treated in hospital for several months. And when he woke up from that coma, he had met Jesus. So the first thing he did when he came to the trial against the friends who had beaten him, the first thing he did was to forgive them. Now he comes to church and he sits side by side with Werner, a retired police officer from Germany who has moved to Broby for some reason. I don't know why. And when I see them, I see the power of the risen Christ. Whatever could make these two persons love each other? And old and young, men and women, natives and immigrants, everything, all the people that we meet in church, they are united by the risen Christ. There is a power in the resurrection that transforms lives, not only 2,000 years ago, but still today. The other person I'd like to tell you about was Lennart. Lennart was a drug addict who became a Christian. He joined our Bible study group. And one day when we read from Philippians chapter 3, the Lord Jesus Christ, who will transform our lowly body to be like his glorious body by the power that enables him even to subject all things to himself. When we spoke about what that meant, and Lennart understood that Jesus, in his glorious body, there were still marks of love in his hands, in his feet, in his heart, in his body. And when he understood that our bodies will also be transformed in a way like Jesus' body, then there came tears in his eyes, and he showed me his arms with marks and said, "So you mean that even these marks will glorify Christ? Then I haven't lived in vain." A couple of months later, his heart couldn't stand it any longer, and he died, waiting for the resurrection of his body.
Thank you, very moving. Thank you. There's many ways to go about. Now I think we will pick up from N.T Wright and let us begin by the extended celebration of Easter. The celebration of Easter has to have some content, I think, other than champagne maybe. What aspects would you want to focus on during the celebration of Easter? And maybe we can pick up on some things that has been said here.
Thank you. Yes, I found these responses, these other presentations extremely interesting. There's lots of things I'd like to pick up, but and your question relates in my mind to what we just heard. How can we make sense of this? In my book, Surprised by Hope, I've argued that if we really believe that one day there will be new heavens and new earth, in which God's justice and glory will be there fully, and that we will share that bodily, then we can be resurrection people, and there's very much what has just been said. If we are working in the present for justice on the one hand, and beauty on the other, if the church is not seen to be working to have things put right in the present, we will only ever do it partially. But if we believe that God has begun that in Jesus and will complete it at the end, then we should be people who, in the strength of the one and in anticipation of the other, are working for justice here and now. And likewise, if we believe that God has already made a beautiful world, but it is flawed and failing and full of ugliness as well, but that one day God's glory will fill the world like the waters cover the sea, then we should also be people who are doing beauty and encouraging art and music and so on. And in all sorts of ways, in the church and out of it. If we are doing those, then it will make much more sense if we are talking about the new life, the new bodily life of Jesus. And those two are quite wide in my mind. It's not just justice in terms of criminal justice or international justice, though they're very important. Before you started to tell those stories, I was thinking of a place I know in Durham where there was an old school which was no longer needed by the school authorities, and a group from one of the churches took it over and turned it into a place where people who suffer from very serious mental or physical disabilities go for most of each day, instead of sitting in a home where they're just sipping a cup of tea and watching mindless stuff on the television. They go there and they do all kinds of projects, one of which is they have these young men with severe disabilities. They can't walk properly, they can't do very much. Sometimes their minds are not in good shape, but they are taught how to mend furniture. And people bring broken chairs, tables, and under supervision, these people who are themselves broken are nevertheless putting things right. And I find that an extraordinarily powerful signal and symbol. And it was done by the church without anyone telling them to. They just thought this was a good idea. And it's when you see that kind of thing, suddenly you think, actually, whatever you say philosophically, post-enlightenmentally, about God intervening or not, and as I said earlier today, I don't actually like the category of miracle because it implies a deist cosmology in which there is an absent God, which is not a biblical view of how things are at all. But if you're doing all that kind of stuff, at whatever level it is, it makes much more sense to talk about Jesus being risen from the dead and about God making a new world and making us over again as well. So that's just a short, brief first answer.
I will leave the mic open. Anyone wants to comment? Okay. So I think we have heard the question raised about worldviews and the importance of worldviews, and I have a quote from N.T Wright here. I will read it. He says that, "Were it not for the astounding and worldview-challenging claim that is thereby made, I think everyone would long since have concluded that this was the correct historical result." And he's talking about the resurrection, of course, that if one tries to show the historical evidence for the resurrection, some people may be blocked by their worldview. And I know, maybe someone would like to comment on that and how we can challenge someone's worldview.
I was thinking about when Bengt was talking about the difference between Meyer and N.T Wright and the different perspectives. If we can involve or how to handle the whole question of God and God acting and so on. And I thought since you brought this big book, someone should quote it. After 718 pages, Professor Wright says, "The proposal that Jesus was bodily raised from the dead possesses unrivaled power to explain the historical data at the heart of early Christianity." And I think in terms of worldview, here is a key concept. We have historical data. What has the power to explain it? And the whole issue of explanatory power. So we deal with the same kind of data, but how can we? How is it to be explained? I absolutely agree with Wright that it's unrivaled power to explain the data. And if you close the universe to God and you just assume this cannot happen, you do not have a good explanation for the historical facts we have. So I think that is one key into the discussion, the whole issue of explanatory power.
Perhaps one could add that there's beginning to be a climate where the old and good slogan or program can find more, you could say, be put more into practice, that whoever proposes a hypothesis has to bring the evidence. And atheists are not, you could say, privileged, but their view is not true from itself, from the beginning. And of course you can give an atheist explanation to the evidence about the resurrection, but then you have to argue for it, and the other way around. And maybe the climate is beginning to be so open that both are accepted, because everybody understands that there is no such thing as a simple truth. It is always a perspective included. And the subjectivity of our knowledge is to be taken for granted, presented, and used, so to say, and argued for. And that, you might say, is beginning to be a little different in academia.
Well, I would like to ask you a thing. When the disciples saw the empty tomb, that didn't transform them. When they met the risen Christ, they started to believe slowly, but they started to believe. But what transformed them was the Holy Spirit. So, are we doing this in vain in some way when we're trying to get the grips on the resurrection? Is that the thing that will transform people?
As always in Christian theology or pastoral work, you need more bits of the puzzle on the table than we often put. And just like in another debate, people sometimes try to solve the puzzle of Paul and justification of the law without mentioning the Holy Spirit, which I think can't be done because the Spirit is always in those discussions somewhere or nearby for Paul. So here, I think sometimes it is part of our Christian collusion with modernity that we kind of accept the rationalist's proposal that we would try to prove something on the rationalist's own grounds. And for me, there was quite an important moment when I'd written that big book on the resurrection. I gave it to, among other people, my old philosophy tutor, who had been an atheist since his teenage years. He is now just turned 80. I'm still in touch with him. And he read that book from cover to cover and wrote me a very interesting letter about it and said, basically, you have produced the best argument I've seen for saying that something like this must have happened. He said, but I simply choose to believe that there must be some other explanation, though at the moment I don't feel any personal necessity to think of what that might have been. It seems to me that's a perfectly honest position, and it highlights the fact that you can't actually force somebody by rational argument to believe. Ultimately, it is to do with the Holy Spirit. I pray for my old tutor cheerfully from time to time, regularly, at least once a week, and would love it if one day he would turn the corner and come to faith. But I think I have taken the argument as far as that will go. And it's, what I think then is that it's a kind of a negative task, that people say, oh, well, we can't believe that because we know that, in fact, the women went to the wrong tomb, or something. And you can go through all the rival explanations and show them, and this was the point of the explanatory power, and show that all the rival explanations are actually more incredible, just simply historically. They ask you to believe too much. But then the question of the worldview comes in, but the question of the worldview is never merely an intellectual one. It involves all kinds of elements of personal response, obedience, fear, love, many things which will not go into the intellectual pot, as it were. And that's part of the joy of it and part of the game of it, as it were. Just one thing more on what Stefan said, which was, I thought, quite important. people often miss the point when you said that this man said that the third day was just a symbol. It's actually quite an important thing to say. Why did the early Christians start meeting for worship on a Sunday? Early enough for it already to be common coin in 1 Corinthians 16 and so on. People do not change the day that they worship just like that on a whim. You know, if you try telling churchgoers in Sweden they must now all turn up on a Tuesday instead of Sunday, well, quite, I just don't think it'll work. Because these things go very deep in a culture, and so you have to say, why did they do that? And if you say, well, somebody originally said on the third day, and they just meant it symbolically, but then within 20 years they took it literally, I'm sorry, I think that's another of those incredible explanations.
I think we've seen in your comments here that you have given examples of atheists who have a so strong faith in their belief that they're not convinced by the evidences. And in one sense that's quite close to the liberal view, where you move the faith of the resurrection into a special sphere of faith. And maybe we can say something about the liberal interpretation of the resurrection and where does this come from? In N.T Wright's book, Jesus and the Victory of God, Professor Wright opts for a third quest for the historical Jesus. One of the characteristics of the former quests is to focus not only on Jesus' sayings, but on his acts as well. Jesus is often thought in our culture as a great wisdom teacher. And I think that maybe this former quest, or this quest's method, has downgraded the resurrection and turned Jesus into something else. Maybe we can talk about that and some other reasons why the resurrection has lost its focus. Give me some time.
About it, but I'd like to hear what others think as well. The story of what is broadly called liberal theology is quite complicated and goes back a long time through the 19th century and so on, has many twists and turns. So just as it's dangerous to say all conservatives or all evangelicals or whatever think A and B and C, it's dangerous to say all liberals do X and Y and Z. However, there are some strands, and they don't always think of themselves as liberal, but some strands, particularly in the Bultmann school, which from a neo-Kantian perspective philosophically in the early years of the 20th century, and then particularly picking up the existentialist perspective of Heidegger, because Bultmann and Heidegger were colleagues in Marburg, everything got focused on sayings and ideas and beliefs, which was able to be presented in terms of a Lutheran doctrine of justification by faith, faith as an internal experience. So it all collapses down into words that people say and experiences of faith that which people have. And then, of course, if you try to construct a Jesus around that, you are left with sayings and then with the faith of the early disciples. It seems to me that the proper response to that is not to take it in its own terms, but to do the history. One of the interesting things, Ed Sanders, who I've mentioned already a couple of times today, a great modern American historian of early Judaism and Christianity, Sanders says that looking back over the 20th century, things took a wrong turn after the First World War, when Bultmann and existentialist theology were really coming in strongly, whereas before then, there were many New Testament scholars who were really historians, archaeologists, papyrologists, etc. And there were people like Deismann in Germany who were trying to understand the whole historical picture of the first century and to locate early Christianity within that. But with the Bultmann school, that quest for the historical first century, as it were, seems to disappear, and it's assumed that there is this thing called Christian faith which exists in almost a non-historical vacuum, and indeed its non-historicalness becomes part of its virtue on the grounds that if you anchor it in history, and one of Bultmann's co-workers, colleagues, Abraham said this, if you base your faith on history, you turn your faith into a work, which then, of course, is what a good Lutheran ought not to do. Most of you in this room will know that better than I do. And so it seems to me there's lots of turns and twists and tangles, and in a sense, the rejection of the bodily resurrection is both the cause of some of that and the result of some of that. And it gets very complex as to how it works out with different theologians. But the right answer, again and again and again, is actually history. Let us study the first century as best we can for all it's worth. I want every coin, every papyrus, every this, every that, researchers to work it all out. The more we know about what life was actually like, the closer we will be to finding out how they actually thought and believed. And I think that is an ongoing challenge, but it's a very positive one. The more you do it, the more it makes sense to understand early Christianity in its own terms. Sorry, that's a miniature version of a lecture, which
I think a lot of us suffers from what C.S. Lewis terms chronological snobbery, that we place ourselves in a position where we think we understand things so much better than previous generations or like the first generations of Christians. And of course, we think of all the success of science in helping us to understand nature, and we think that has changed the whole way we then are thinking. So often it comes into play the whole perspective of they believed certain things because they were so much more primitive than we are. I don't think it's very helpful to see, as Professor Wright has written quite a lot about, that they, in the first generation of Christians and in antiquity, were dealing with very much the same categories that we are dealing with. They knew that dead people did not come alive again, or were not resurrected by itself. That's not a new discovery, that dead people stay dead. They knew it. So they were not primitive in that sense. They could distinguish between a dream and being awake. They knew the difference between a vision and what they testified about meeting the resurrected Jesus. That was something else. That was not a vision or a dream. So a lot of those categories were quite similar at that time, even though they of course lacked our specific knowledge about processes in nature and so on. They knew that if you were lost a loved one, you could have the experience of seeing and feeling that person a time after the death of the loved ones. But they did not confuse that with, wow, my wife must be resurrected now. So I think here's a lot of important things to reflect on, so we do not make this mistake of the chronological snobbery.
And what is the role of historical investigation of Jesus as a whole and the resurrection specifically? Well, I would say it is not unimportant, but what you said, Don, from a parish priest's view, it reminds us of the fact that probably very few people come to the faith through intellectual persuasion. On the other hand, of course, we should not think, as perhaps some Christians also have been too ready to think, that when it comes to science or research, we are hopelessly lost. We don't have a good case to present. And I think that an 800-page book like Professor Wright's on the resurrection shows that this is not the case. There is actually, that we are always intellectually inferior, trying to believe this. There is a good case to be made for it, but it does not decide faith. It doesn't limit faith. And the whole of historical research on Jesus is not the basis of faith. So faith has to be entered to and welcomed on its, in its own ways. And that has much more to do with what we pointed out, life lived. So a conviction turned into, you could say, flesh and blood reality. that it convinces far more. But this is a kind of, you could say, preparatory study in the very limited field of scientific research, which does not cover and cannot explain all of reality, especially not when we come to the larger reality above us, the divine world, God, the creation, and so on.
One footnote to that, if I might. I fully agree, historical research on Jesus is not a great way to bring people to faith. However, in my experience, a great many Christians in several different traditions have actually forgotten what the Gospels are really talking about, because they hear the Gospels in little 10 or 12 verse snippets week by week, and often preached about as little moral lessons to get you through this next week. And they have lost the big picture of what the Gospels are saying, which, in the words of another book, which I think is not yet translated into Swedish, the Gospels are telling the story of, quote, how God became king, unquote. That is so huge, so counterintuitive in the post-Enlightenment world. It's about theocracy. And theocracy is a dangerous word in our world. It reminds us of mad clerics with the hotline to God telling everyone what length their beards should be or whatever. There's two of us here which are in trouble here. But the point about theocracy is, which God are we talking about? If you're, here the deist problem is acute. If you're talking about a deist God, he sounds like a rather careless, faceless bureaucrat in the sky. We don't much want him to be in charge. But if you're talking about the God we know in Jesus of Nazareth, then that's very different. And that's why the historical research is important. Not to give you a different Jesus than the one you find in the Gospels, but to give you the Jesus that the Gospels are desperately trying to tell us about, and that the Church has managed to hush up. And it seems to me that the more we do the historical research, the more actually the Jesus of the Gospels comes up in 3 dimensions, and is very compelling, very much more attractive than the thin, insubstantial Jesus, the teacher of a few moral truths here, who then happens to go and do a messy thing at the end, which somehow sends us to heaven. That's what a lot of Christians think. And Jesus is much more interesting than that. And sometimes it takes the historical research to generate fresh oomph about where we're going with all of that.
It's true. I think it's very important that this study work is done, that this research work is done for the church, because that provides us with the good arguments. We must show people that we have the best arguments in this case. But how is it? Do you think we could challenge this liberal, subjective, Platonic, deistic worldview that is ruling in the academic world, in the church world, in the community?
I think that's a question I want to pose to you, each one of you, and that you would give. There are different kind of groups here today. It's a lot of pastors and priests and students and theological students and all the like. Could you give them your best tip or your best tips about advice? How should we do this? If we agree about what you have said today, what should we do in order to remind the church about the resurrection? And what would you want to lift up as important for the church to do?
I would say the best thing is to pray publicly to Jesus as if he were alive.
Well, there's a lot of things that comes to mind. Not in terms of simple advices, do this and then this will happen, but more in terms of what kind of needs do I see within the church and talking, especially as I travel around talking with young Christians and with students. And then I would say, because of the influence of secularism, we need to address the wider worldview questions. We need to address the questions of the existence of God, because if God does not exist, the whole question of the resurrection will just disappear, or will just be a very mystical thing. So we need to address those bigger worldview issues. We really need to do what we are doing at this conference, to dig deep into history and to see the explanatory power that the resurrection gives to the historical data. And we need to do what Professor Wright so powerfully is doing, to connect the resurrection as an event to the whole scope of the universe. This is about God rescuing the whole world. This is about the future. This is not an isolated event. Did he come alive again or not? But it is so much bigger. Often we have discussions about the isolated event. Did it happen? But we need to see how that is connected to the whole history of the cosmos and all that is that it is related to.
Well, I was the one who asked the question, wasn't I? I think that to have the knowledge base is very important for Christians. I think that we must teach our friends, our common Christians in our churches, what the gospel is, what the story of Jesus is about. That it is something more than just for a personal satisfaction. It involves all creation. It's His story, history. It's His world. It's His community. I would like to see church form arts. I know you write about this in Surprised by Hope. I would like church to take place in the community again and be not defensive, but I don't think offensive is the right word, but you know what I mean, I guess.
Recently in the UK, various financial institutions have become much more aggressive, and especially with increase in poverty, things which used to happen in back streets only, where if you were really short of money, somebody would lend you money on a short term, but at a sort of 2,000% interest or whatever. That is now happening big time on the internet with big advertisements on the buses and so on. And many pastors of churches in areas of great poverty, and the diocese that I served for 7 years was one of the poorest areas in Britain, so I know a bit about that. They see people in their congregations being drawn into these terrible, crippling situations of going deeper and deeper and deeper into debt. And the companies that run these loans companies making lots of profit for their shareholders out of other people's misery. The Archbishop of Canterbury, 2 or 3 weeks ago, took this on and met the head of one of these loan companies who is making millions out of poor people. And he said, I could, in the House of Lords, try and pass a law that would make what you're doing illegal. That might or might not get through. He said, we're not going to do that. He said, we're going to put you out of business by starting church-based credit unions that will have only enough profit to serve what we're actually doing. They'll be not-for-profit organizations. And people will come to those and they will realize that what you're doing is not what they should do. That is amazingly creative. It's a wonderful thing for an archbishop to do. And I tell you that story because what I was going to say, but just you saying what you did made me realize that strikes a blow which says we care about the poor, we care about different ways of being human, we care about justice, But we're not going to be all prissy and mealy-mouthed about it. We're going to find cheerful, outward-going ways of actually doing something which will address the problem and come at it in a different way. I think it's fantastic. Pray for Justin, our Archbishop, because he's got many pressures on him. But what I was going to say was this. In the early church, between, say, 50 AD and 300 AD, the Romans, on and off, were doing their best to persecute the church out of existence. Not all the time, but quite a bit of the time. Sporadic, but it was nasty when it happened. Why did more and more and more people become Christians? It wasn't because Origen and Irenaeus and Tertullian and had great ideas which they wrote big books about and passed from one brain to another. That's important. That's part of the kind of structure. Like, you know, this building will have structures inside the walls. We can't see them. If they weren't there, we'd fall down. However, the reasons that people became Christians were that local communities were caring for the poor, were feeding the hungry, were healing the sick, so that, for instance, when a plague would strike a town in, say, Asia Minor, the rich and the respectable would get out and run, the Christians would stay and would nurse the sick, even sometimes catching the plague themselves. And when it was all over, people would say to the church, why did you do that? Nobody's ever done that, helping people who are not their family, not their kith and kin. And they would say, there is this man Jesus, and we love him and we follow him. People would say, well, even if they're trying to stamp this movement out, this is a better way to be human than anything we've yet seen. And then the arguments will actually fall into place comparatively easily. Remember, when Jesus was asked, when Jesus told parables, at least a third to a half of the time, the reason was he was being asked, why are you doing that? And he told stories about a father who had 2 sons or whatever. The question for us is, what should the church be doing that would make people say, why are you doing that? It's dangerous or scandalous or not how we've always done it or whatever. And the answer would be to tell in fresh ways the story of Jesus. And then, as I say, the arguments, they may not look after themselves entirely, but they'll have a flying start.
Maybe we should open up for some questions from the audience. Okay, over here.
Thank you very much, all of you, for this very interesting discussion. I think the last point that was being made here is, at least to me, the most interesting one from a personal perspective. I'm a PhD student in the field of medicine, and in my research group, we actually quite often have discussions regarding our existence and what we're doing and why we're doing it, and we often touch upon subjects that are at least bordering on existentialism, different aspects, such as what we have discussed here tonight. To me, it's obvious that you could do a lot of good. As a church, you can do a lot of good, feeding the poor and helping the sick. But in an academic situation, in a welfare state, especially in a city like Lund, where everyone is more or less very well off, and we are highly educated, and we are healthy, and we're doing well in general, where is the appeal? And how is the church addressing the fact that most people no longer can relate to the concept of sin? They don't, when I talk to people about my faith, they don't see the point. They don't see why they need a Savior. And they don't see why the resurrection matters at all, because, they're doing the best they can, and they're leading good lives, and everything is fine, right?
So the question for those of you who didn't hear is about, we live in a welfare state, like especially here in Lund, where everybody seems to have everything they want. And what's the appeal, the Christian appeal? How can Jesus be their Savior?
Well, Per, I think you have people around you that you love, and you see what their needs are in this happiness. they still have needs. And the people you love, in what way can you serve them in their needs? And when you start there, things will get dangerous.
No one is young, beautiful, strong and rich all their life. and of course for a period or in a certain situation, a human being can live with the impression that I don't have that many needs. But I wonder if anyone in the long run can continue with that. Everyone faces one's own limitations and weakness, and if we are honest, our own brokenness and inner corruption, sooner or later. If we see in this welfare country where huge groups do not have much of financial needs or that kinds of needs, we also see that questions of inner emptiness and loneliness is epidemic. We see young people in Sweden, teenagers, they are suffering psychologically much more than in some other countries. We have a lot of problems with self-destructive behavior and suicide and so on. So even though this is a very nice city, we shouldn't paint it too slick picture of it. I think there is under the surface, there is also in this kind of situation all kinds of struggles and pain and so on, which the Gospel actually addresses. One of the big problems we have in our culture is that we are not really open with this, I think. This is things that we generally, as Swedes, try to handle ourselves, and we do not share our situations that easily, compared to some other countries, I think, where people tend to be more open in relating to those questions. So here we have a lot to learn from other countries. I think we can, with a lot of the immigrants coming in and different cultures coming to Sweden, that will change our culture to the better in this respect.
Yes. Thank you for this lovely discussion and for the speeches early on. The resurrection is not only a theological or historical issue, it is a pastoral and crucial point, I think, for the future within our country and in the Western Church, is really to proclaim the message. I'm a team rector. In my area, there are about 180 funerals every year, and we have 170 out of them. We are proclaiming the gospel each week, and I think that we always need to focus on that. When I was a young priest, my first 5 months, I had 52 funerals. I was dreaming funerals, I was having troubles, I was at my own funeral, my loved one's funeral, and everything in my dreams. And I had problem with the resurrection. But my vicar then gave me a book by Rengstorff about Jesus' resurrection. And I think the second book that helped me further was Surprised by Hope. And I really commend it. And I think that we need to, having had all these 2,000 funerals in my time as a priest, I think this is really the crucial point, that we give the message of hope, the message of comfort, the message of God's mercy within the situation, and make it out of our own faith, and that we really do believe. Otherwise, I think we are futile.
I'm not sure if that was a question, but would you like to? Yeah.
I just want to thank you for an interesting discussion. I'm Aaron, and I have a kind of a weird background where I've traveled from Canada to Denmark from an evangelical background into a Lutheran context. And one thing that has really struck me about the Lutheran Church in Scandinavia is that the Scandinavian dream and welfare system really sustains society, but it was actually the churches that started doing all these works with the poor and so forth, and then we handed it over to the state. And we lost a lot of power. I know in the Anglican Church, there's still lots of things going on with schools and lots of things, and every time I'm in England, I'm really impressed with all the activities going on. But in Scandinavia, it's really hard for the church to have a public role because the government should take care of it. And the problem is that the government isn't helping people because they ought to help people. It's because it's mandated by rules in some sense. And there are countless of cases in Denmark where people that are entitled to help aren't getting the help they need, or some way in a wrong system or documents or whatever. And I'm just wondering if the churches of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden should react more by taking back the responsibility, because clearly the government isn't doing its job right. Yeah.
When I was Bishop of Durham, I was involved in quite a lot of things in the public life because of the public role that bishops have in church and so on. So I've seen exactly this problem. The problem is that the state now has assumed, ever since the Enlightenment actually, that in Britain, that it's in charge of hospitals, it's in charge of education. Those were two classically Christian things. Until the Christian movement, nobody was doing education for everybody. Nobody was doing medicine for everybody. It was for the rich and those who could afford it, or for your relatives, or whatever. This was a church thing, and we should celebrate the fact that actually this has got into public consciousness as a wider obligation. However, when the state takes over something, the state is very capable of distorting it, of twisting it, setting up new rules, for instance with a system of requiring doctors and nurses to perform abortions, whatever their conscience, etc., and lots of other things. I know this is a touchy issue, but lots of other things like that, where the state says, now we run this. And so here's the other thing that the church has to do. The church has the vocation, ever since John 16, to speak the truth to power. And there's a lot of distortion of power, corruption, etc. The media think it's their job to tell the powerful what they should be doing. But the media and the powerful regularly collude, and it is in fact the church's job. And we have become bad at that, we've not been used to it, we don't know how to do it, we need to recover it. Not in a negative, carping, slighting way, but in a positive way. And the other thing I want to say, actually, I didn't realise that people in Lund might feel like that, and I'm intrigued, because I don't think we have many places in the UK where that is a problem, the problem you describe as a problem. But we live in a global village, and there's awful things going on down the road. We cannot avoid that. Obviously, it's nice for us, nice for me in St Andrews, nice for you in Lund, that St Andrews is a peaceful and cheerful university town, and people are reasonably well off, and rich American golfers come there to play, etc., etc. But we are part of the global family, and it's part of the church's job to campaign on things like global debt, on things like climate change, which is going to affect the poorest regions of the world, etc. And we need to be more concerned about that, and not simply because that's where you see the effects of sin writ across the world, and come back to haunt us if we simply live in a bubble.
Talking about the Swedish situation, it was partly deliberate from the side of the state to take away some of the responsibilities from the church and run by the state. Whatever we think politically now, it is a fact that the world-famous Swedish welfare system is falling apart to some degree, and there is a possibility for the church to really take a step forward now and do things. And just so you don't misinterpret the situation in Sweden, you will, in many places, in many cities, hear a different story than we hear about it. So there is so many needs that a local church can address and can help people who are really feeling their needs.
I was on a Fresh Expressions conference in Cambridge, an international conference last week. The Anglican Church, the Methodist Church, and other churches are seeking new ways to try to be church in the modern society. And what struck me there was that they did not start by thinking about what activity the church could do. They started with, what do I love to do? And which people do I love around me? And what are their needs? And when I can see that, I can start build relationships between different people, and then we can start an activity. But it always has to start with love. That it is the love of the poor, it is the love of the needy that will change and transform the society, not the church's activities.
I think you can hear me. I just wanted to give a comment on another thing you can try. I've personally done it, and I'm still doing it, and it is to live in a new monastic community. So we move together, people that are not biologically related, and I'm even there with my husband, and this raises questions all the time, all over the place. What? Do you all put your money together and you buy stuff from that, and you don't properly own stuff, and you're not consuming like the rest of the society? Or like, what? Are you gonna have children when there's other people around looking at you, what you're doing with them? And things like that. There's lots of creative stuff we can be doing, really. So just challenge yourself.
Yeah, would you like to comment on that? Anyone?
I was eating supper with a friend here in Lund, and I just explained what I'm doing here. And then I told her about the resurrection and what it means to the world today, and she just asked me a question that I couldn't answer. She said, why can't we see that death is defeated? And I had problems to give her an answer, because death is still giving us a hard time.
There are some points where you do go back again and again to the basic proclamation about Jesus, and that all that I've said and that we've all said about ways in which this must be implemented in the wider world, that's fine, but the church hasn't got a cure for death in its pocket, in the sense of giving people perpetual life. There's stuff you can understand about death. When you talk, as many of you pastors do regularly, more than I have done, to people who are dying, in many cases, particularly Christians, they will know, they will realize and recognize that this is actually, their time is nearly drawing to a close, and that is appropriate. There is an appropriateness about it, and that the way we are as corruptible, physically as well as morally corruptible human beings, there is an appropriateness, just like you have to explain to an over-lively child that it really is time to go to bed, and that bad things are going to be going on inside your skull unless you go to bed and sleep. So we need to learn to accept our frailty and our mortality, and instead of railing against it, Dylan Thomas' poem, Rail, Rail Against the Dying of the Light, and so on. No, there is a sense that we are who we are, accepting finitude. It's humility, really. But having said that, we've got to go back again and again to talk about Jesus himself. And the act of faith is to say we believe in a world in which the living God, the Creator, has raised his Son, Jesus, from the dead. everything that we do relates to that, grows out of that, and one day that will be implemented across the board. But accepting that, believing that, is faith. You can't actually see it. You can't say, here's 15 examples where we've rescued people from death and they're now alive forever, because that's not what we do. So it is a matter of going back to the actual gospel events.
I think the language of the New Testament of Jesus as the firstborn from death is very important here. So the proclamation is that at one point the new life has been brought forth and Jesus is resurrected. But the first Christians, we see the brother of John, James, be beheaded, and they bury him. And we see Stephen being stoned, and they bury him. So they were very aware that death had not been finally and completely defeated by God raising Jesus from the dead. He was the firstborn and the proof of the victory over death. But death is still reigning until Jesus is coming back, and death is the final enemy who will finally be defeated. But in the sense of affecting the world, death is not defeated yet. It's still here, and it seems that the first generation of Christians took that for granted. They knew this was something that so far has happened with Jesus, and not with the rest of humanity, or yet with the followers of Jesus.
Perhaps we could compare this life to the period of pregnancy when you are 40 weeks inside your mother. It's not a great idea to prolong the pregnancy, but it's a time when you are ripe for deliverance. And perhaps that's one part of the answer. And you could also say that, well, perhaps we follow Jesus' example. We die with him, and that makes all the difference, because then we will be raised with him too. But this life and its betterment is not the ultimate goal, actually. And of course, the period is not 40 weeks or a set one. It differs very much from people to people.
Do we have any final comments from the panel? You should prepare them now.
The demo version is released. Soon the real version is coming.
I think I've had my final comments already more than once.
Please, a big applause for the panel. Thank you very much. There will be some refreshment in the hall, so please enjoy yourself. We have to be out of here in 45 minutes, so yeah.